So the endpoints, we talked a little bit about those, and that's determined primarily by the team of experts who developed that protocol. It must be measurable. The duration of pulling out those endpoints is really important. And then there's stopping rules. If you go a certain time frame and you don't see any benefit at all, then that protocol should be, or it could be stopped. And then there's primary versus secondary endpoints. And the key thing is usually it's those primary endpoints that really drive the protocols. And the secondary ones, that's added information, gained information. But the key thing is that primary endpoint. And usually most protocols will have at least should have just that one primary endpoint. And then finally, this transition to standard of care. Once the trial ends, there may be an extension to a trial as data is still being evaluated before it opens up and is considered to be standard of care. So there may be a fair amount of time in between the time that a study is completed and then have peer review and acceptance within the medical community. There may be additional trials that are needed from the first trial in order to really know if it's effective. But this whole transition is what we key in on. And I suppose an example for this might be the optic pathway tumors, that at some point in time for optic pathway tumors in NF1, they were treated very differently than they are now. We now recognize that the kids respond very well to chemotherapy. Even carboplatin alone sometimes works okay, but it's usually carboplatin and vincristine. And so nowadays, there's been enough protocols that have been performed that this is the standard of care. So a child with an optic pathway tumor that's symptomatic or that shows progression on MRI scans, that's the time that you say, okay, this is the protocol to use, and we know that it's going to be effective for most kids. And you may have to adjust things as the results come in. So let's move on to the examples of NF1 clinical trials. This is probably what you're really most interested in hearing about. There can be observational or natural history studies, quality of life, and then what you really think about in a clinical trial is treatment. And it could be this phase 1 safety, it could be effectiveness, they can be open label, placebo controlled. So there's a number of ways that trials can be conducted. But I wanted to move on to, well, how do you find out about these trials? And the clinicaltrials.gov has, I would say in the last couple of years, have really pushed most institutions. If there's a clinical trial going on at your academic center, it's going to be listed. And sometimes it's listed twice, sometimes 3 times. It's unusual. It's not quite as good as you might think. The filtering component is not as good as you might think it could be, but at least they're getting in there. And this particular site is linked to so many sites. You can get to it many, many different ways, and certainly ctf.org has a link to it. So right now, clinicaltrials.gov, it lists almost 90,000 clinical trials with locations in a whole bunch of countries across the world. When I put in for NF1, there were 47 trials that were listed. 36 were truly specific for NF1, and 26 are now in a recruiting phase. I had no idea there were that many that were recruiting. So there's different, and I'll go through these, but the 8 categories that I sort of subdivided out of these 26 recruiting trials had to do with neurofibromas, and you'll hear about the plexiform trials, MPNSTs, bone studies, ADHD, so attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, reading issues, quality of life, and imaging studies. So this is from clinicaltrials.gov. They actually show you where these different trials are. This is just for the U.S. So these are all the trials in the U.S. So I think you can pick out your own state, you know, whatever state. It's amazing. Kentucky has almost 3,000 clinical trials going on. I look at Utah and I think, you know, the population base that we have, that's a lot of clinical trials. So how many of those are NF? Well, you can actually query that. So out of 25 studies found by searching, so this is just a search, these are the different states that have these listed. That's not to say that they're not necessarily going on in those states, but this is what's listed in clinicaltrials.gov. So if we take of those 25 some odd studies, I've just put down a few of them. Here's 5 top ones, and I think we're off the screen a little bit, at least what I'm seeing. You can see up there. So I've just listed the first 5 that show up, and even though the typing is a little hard to pick up, these are all recruiting studies, and you can see the titles. One of them is the lovastatin trial. There's another that's a trial I wasn't aware of in plexiforms, this AZD 2171 in neurofibromas near the spine. So here's the next 5, so here's essentially what would be the top 10 that are listed. And sometimes you'll see them listed twice. These are the ones that are actively recruiting, but you can see on that site that there's some that are not recruiting. They're completed trials, they're completed studies. So I just wanted to take what would I see in Utah, which is the one I'm familiar with, and here there are 7 different NF1 studies that are listed there. And if I pull those up, these are ones that I'm very familiar with, simply because there's only one institution in Utah, one academic center, that's actually conducting these trials. But you can see there's a whole list you can look at, and then you can pop into each one of these and find out, well, what were the exclusion-inclusion criteria, who's conducting the trial. There's a lot of information that's contained within there. And so here's one that there was one listed in California for NF1. I suspect we're going to hear differently. Yes. Yeah, I think there's going to be a few more that are just not listed yet. But here you can see, I just wanted to show that this is, it talks about the recruitment. There's a lot of information devoted to what is the trial set up to do, what type of trial it is, what's the study design, the allocation, this one's randomized, placebo-controlled. So you can see that it goes through all the process of how is this clinical trial run. And then eventually it tells you who the individual is. So when I plugged in, so it's not perfect. When I put in MP and ST, I got nothing. But if you look down, there's a list that you can go through alphabetically, and you can pull up what's the next best thing. And sarcoma is one thing, but that's relatively broad. So I found out of the best category to screen was this malignant mesenchymal tumor, which is sort of a category that MP and ST can fit into. And here it shows you there's 254 studies in different states, which I like the idea of being able to look at the states, because most insurance plans are set up state-wise, and so if you're living in a specific state, it doesn't mean you can't go somewhere else, but you're going to have to work a little harder to get insurance coverage to do so. So out of this 254, here's just a list of some of them, a couple of them. And what you find out is that they're not specific to NF1. So within a group of tumors that are being treated, there may be a few individuals with NF1 that are within that group. So first off, there could be types of tumors for which the NF1 related type tumor is only one of many. And then within that category, there are some individuals who have NF1 and some who do not. So you have to, the information that can be gained by some of those studies is not quite as strong as if you start with this NF consortium that Dr. Korf described a little bit last night. And so I think I just wanted to close with that, sharing with you that there clearly are places to go to find out information, but what I'd like to instill is that there are still a restricted number of academic centers that are really tuned in to doing these trials. And it's going to take a little effort to find the right site that fits what your needs are. And calling around, working with coordinators, perhaps is the best approach to take. And all of these trials, they have contact individuals, and you can find out, is it going to be reasonable? Do they have funds to cover travel? Are they actively recruiting? And then you can hear about what would be the inclusion-exclusion criteria as well. So finding the site, find that site, clinical trials, and go for it. I don't know if this is Hoover Dam here or not, but those of you who have some time tomorrow, I suspect you're going to be checking out Lake Mead. And with that, I'll just close. So thanks.